Shaping of Gondor, Part 1. The Birth of Gondor. Chapter 3. The Last Alliance. Just when, exactly, Sauron made his way back to Middle-earth from the dark abyss that had consumed Numenor is not known. What is known is that from about 3370 onward, the orcs and fell beasts of the Ash Mountains, as well as the barbarian heathens of Harad and Khan to the south, began to mass once more in Mordor, under the renewed occupancy of Barad-dûr. Sauron, whatever harm he had sustained from Numenor's destruction, had evidently lost none of his malevolence, and nor was he pleased to find a powerful new kingdom of men flourishing at his very doorstep. Although he did not challenge the Edain with open war just yet, he did his best to keep them occupied with orcish raids across the mountain passes, as well as steady harassment from the south through his alliance with the men of the Southlands. The years 3376, 3381, and 3399 each saw major raids on the royal ward, each more deadly and determined than the last, issuing from both the north and south. To combat these incursions, the Diarchy was forced to greatly enlarge the White Guard, as well as strengthen the defences of the capital of Osgiliath, Minas Anor, and Minas Ithil. This led in turn to an increase in taxes upon the fiefs, something taken not at all lightly by the Crondiers. In 3396, one of them, Ingril, Lord of Belfalas, raised the banner of a revolt against the crown, in protest of these taxes, and was swiftly and mercilessly defeated in a quote-unquote battle near Peneth Gelen, in which King Isildur killed the rebels very nearly to a man. In this victory, Isildur preserved the authority of the crown, but it also showed on how shaky a ground that authority rested upon just 76 years after the obeisance of Pelargir. It was a lesson that would have to be relearned painfully all too soon. In light of the ferocity of the attacks from both south and east, the Diarchy saw the wisdom of building fortifications, particularly in defense of the naturally vulnerable royal ward, and in 3399, shortly after the third Orcish raid, construction began on what would become known as the Northern March, or Anarion's Wall, since it was Anarion who most closely supervised the project. It was a mammoth undertaking, for manpower and money were scarce, and its completion would have to wait until long after the end of the Diarchy. This was unfortunate, for Mordor's strength was by now rapidly reviving. Like the slowly filling caldera of a volcano, her forces grew and grew, supplied by Haradrim and Kandari, eager to rejoin their former master, as well as eastern barbarian contingents to the east of Rhovanion and the Sea of Rhûn. By 3410, the Gondorian watch on the Black Gates had to be withdrawn in the face of Mordoric assaults, and by 3420, the garrison in the Vale of Morgul too had to be abandoned. Pelargir and the entire mouth of the Anduin was increasingly becoming endangered by Umbardrum Corsair raids, and in 3425 the Diarchy began constructing an impressive highway to link Pelargir to Osgiliath and the royal ward, to better aid the shuttling of troops and supplies between the two cities. Then Gondor's time finally ran out. In 3429, Sauron openly declared himself in Mordor, proclaiming himself once more to be the supreme overlord of the continent and all its inhabitants, and demanded that all the latter pledge obeisance to himself under pain of destruction and death. This was done with a special eye tilted toward the two kingdoms of the Edain, and messages were sent to both Osgiliath and Enumenas with the succinct proposal, quote-unquote, "Thy kingdoms for thy lives." Both Elendil and the Diarchy refused to submit, naturally, as did numerous other rulers of the lands of Middle-earth, to whom similar ultimatums had been dispatched. War swiftly followed. Sauron struck almost immediately by placing Minas Ithil under siege. The fortress had been well stocked and garrisoned, but Mordor's superiority in numbers was overwhelming, and the city fell after 3 months, whereupon Sauron, hoping to knock Gondor out of the war early, pressed his advantage by advancing a large army to besiege Osgiliath itself. Here, most fortunately for the Gondorians, the Dark Lord underestimated his foe, for Osgiliath's fortifications were formidable, and deep within the royal ward his forces were isolated among a hostile population, which impeded and harassed his soldiers without mercy. Further, he was forced to rely solely on land power, since although Pelargir was also put under siege to the south by a large corsair fleet, that powerful city resisted capture every bit as stubbornly as the capital, so for the moment the war shuddered to a stalemate. Nevertheless, Isildur and Anarion knew it was a losing battle. Mordor had nearly inexhaustible access to reinforcements from the south and east, whereas Gondor's manpower was limited, and if the war was to continue year after year, sooner or later she would eventually be defeated and overrun. What was needed was a massive infusion of fresh and battle-ready troops, one which could tip the scale irretrievably against Sauron's vast Orcish and Mannish hosts. Only from one quarter in Middle-earth could such a force be found, in the kingdoms of the elves, men, and dwarves to the north. It was there that Isildur travelled secretly by ship in the autumn of 3429, whilst Anarion maintained the defence of Osgiliath. After a long and harassed journey, for the reach of the Umbadrum corsairs extended far north by this time, Isildur made landfall in Mithlond, the chief haven of the kingdom of Lindon, where he was greeted by Gil-galad and his father Elendil, who had been invited there by the elvish king. Together the three took counsel. What was to be done? Gondor's strength was considerable, but not limitless, and could not be expected to hold out forever against Mordor. Nor was there any point in relocating the Gondorian population to some northern region, since once Mordor had absorbed her lands and resources, it would be only a matter of time before Sauron invaded northern and western Middle-earth, as he had done in the past, and this time there would be no Númenorian fleet to repulse him. Yet the only alternative was a full-fledged military strike, and that would almost certainly result in severe bloodshed among the free peoples of the north and west. A smaller force could be sent to Gondor's aid, to be sure, but that would in all likelihood only delay the inevitable, and bring about a constant drain on the manpower of wider Middle-earth, and condemn the continent to a perpetual state of slow-burning war to the profit of Mordor. It was a difficult choice, but in the end it was decided that Sauron simply could not be allowed to remain unchallenged in Mordor, and that a full assault would have to be launched on the Black Land, with all the resources and men, weapons, and treasure that Middle-earth could muster. An alliance of elves, men, and dwarves, to defy and destroy the forces of darkness and evil once and for all. From this point onward, the story takes on an almost mythical tone, and for the sake of clarity and brevity, I will not belabor every small detail. Countless mummers, minstrels, and scribes have immortalized its events over the centuries for those who thirst for minutiae. Word was sped throughout the free lands of Middle-earth of the war effort, and slowly soldiers began to gather at Annúminas and Mithlond, made all the more sluggish by the wildness and thinly populated nature of Elendil's kingdom, and by the inertia of Gil-galad's. It was fortunate that war preparations were begun as early as they were, and that Gondor resisted the sieges of Osgiliath and Pelargir as manfully as she did, for it gave the north the advantage of time, without which its full strength might not have been able to be assembled sufficiently. It was time well spent, however, and in 3431 the kings of Lindon and Arnor, having at last gathered their full forces, converged at the fortress of Amun Sul, whereupon they marched eastward to Imladris, where they made camp under the hospitality of Elrond Half-Elven. 2 years more were spent in this place, while the army leaders drew their plans for the advance on Mordor, and the troops, which some estimate at 80,000 in number at this point, trained and forged weapons and arms for the coming invasion. By the time the assembly finally departed Imladris in the early spring of 3434, it was a formidable host indeed. Down the western length of the misty mountains they advanced before traversing the treacherous pass of Caradhras, and moving east toward the elven realms of Greenwood and Lorinand. The armies then paused on the field of Celebrant, where they received further reinforcements from Amdir of Lorinand, Orifor of Greenwood, and Durin the Fourth of Khazad-dûm, all of whom led their troops in person. 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 Although the exact numbers of these legions are not well known, the legends speak of some many thousands, and all were grim and well armed with sword and shield. Not since the First Age had a force composed of warriors representing each of the races of the children of Eru been seen in Middle-earth: elves, dwarves, and men, and never would it be seen again. For this reason we know it as the Last Alliance, and the mighty struggle it was about to unleash as the War of the Last Alliance. Advancing like a mighty thunderstorm through Calenarthon and Anorion in a matter of days, the Alliance entered Gondor and approached Osgiliath from the northwest, intent on breaking the siege which had now been under way for 5 long years. It came none too soon, for the defenders under Anarion were weary indeed, and nearly starved of supplies. Sauron's besieging army was caught nearly unawares, not expecting such a relief force of this power and immensity, and were routed nearly to a man by the advanced battalions of the Alliance's assault. The siege was broken, therefore. Anarion was reunited with his father and brother, and great were the feelings of festivity among the men on the fields of Pelennor that day. The war now proceeded rapidly. With their capital secured, Isildur and Anarion lost no time in marshalling the Stoneland's full strength for the great confrontation of the age. Conscriptions were sent from end to end of the kingdom, and it is said that no man between 16 and 60 years of age was to be found between the Anduin and the Lefnui after the call to arms. The towns and villages of the provinces were ransacked for stores and supplies. Every forge and foundry was lit ablaze to manufacture weapons of hard iron and steel as the soldiers formed ranks. One group who did not answer the call to arms were the infamous Men of the Mountain. They were a tribe who had dwelt in the vales of the western White Mountains long ere the region's settlement by the Númenóreans, and had frequently allied with Sauron in his wars against the men and elves of Middle-earth. Although they had abjured all loyalty to the Dark Lord in the years immediately after the obeisance of Pelargir, and had sworn an oath of fealty to Isildur and Anarion at Eric, they now proceeded to break that vow, fleeing deep into the unexplored caves and defiles of the mountains, rather than fight their former master. Isildur, in his wrath, responded to this betrayal by laying a fierce curse upon the traitors, to the effect that they should never rest until their oath should be fulfilled in the service of Gondor. About 8 weeks after the relief of the capital, a force of nearly 20,000 orcs and eastern warriors poured out of the Vale of Morgul by way of Minas Ithil and slammed into Osgiliath in a second attempt to take it. It was in vain, however, for forces under Elendil and Isildur circled around to the south and caught the invaders in a pincer attack and decimated them almost to a man. This second defeat of Mordor surpassed even the first, since those who had been beaten during the relief of Osgiliath had been taken by surprise, and had been weary from the fatigue of a long siege. These, however, were fresh troops, with the benefit of surprise themselves, and they had been defeated by a greater margin than the first. It was a telling demonstration of the potency of the last alliance, one which Sauron would have done well to have taken warning from. By the time of the summer of 3434 was drawing to its close, the last of the Gondorian conscriptions had assembled, and the captains of the last alliance found themselves at the head of an army of 120,000 strong. Some scribes placed that number higher, at around 200,000 or even 300,000, but these are almost certainly exaggerations, as the land would not have been capable of supporting such a force. When all was judged to be in readiness, the signal was given, and the mighty host began to roll northeast like an invincible flood through Ithilien towards the black gate of Mordor. What a sight it must have been! Elendil and his sons and grandsons led their many battalions arrayed in silver and black, with the trees of Valinor emblazoned on their banners. Gil-galad rode in the vanguard, clad in armor that flashed fiercely golden in the sun, with his spear Aglos in his hand. Elrond Half-Elven served as his herald. Flanking these were the armies of Lorenan, Greenwood, and Khazad-dûm, all armed to the teeth and resplendent in the colors and sigils of their homelands, in a grand and glorious display. On the 4th of Yavanne, after a march of 8 days, the army of the last alliance finally drew near to the Black Gate. Just to the north of it sat a vast plain, largely barren and empty of vegetation, and it was there that the force had its first encounter with the enemy, hence its name, Dagorlad, or Battle Plain. Sauron had not been napping, of course. His spies had kept him well informed of the numbers and movements of the Alliance, and, in his two recent losses on the field notwithstanding, was not fazed in the least by it. Drawing on the full resources of his superior numbers, he flung a massive army of 200,000 through the Black Gate, while diverting a smaller second contingent of around 30,000 around the spur of the Ash Mountains to the west, intent on catching his opponents in a flanking maneuver. The Battle of Dagorlad began very badly for the last alliance. Sauron's vanguard, led by the fearsome undead Lord of the Nazgul, slammed into the Alliance's center, at which time the one great tactical mistake during the war on the latter's part was made. It appears that both Orifer and Amdir resented being made to serve under the command of Gilgalad, who was, after all, of a different kindred of elves, and were determined not to be outshone in fighting prowess by the High King. Deciding to take the glory for themselves, the two kings charged all in ahead of the rest of the army without proper infantry support, and though they both fought like demons, they were soon encircled, overwhelmed, and killed. It was a grievous loss, and what swiftly turned into a grueling, bloody battle. Bloodiest battle of the Second Age. Having lost their commanders, the remaining battalions of Loreland and Greenwood regrouped behind Gilgalad and Elendil, and proceeded to wreak all hell upon Mordor's soldiers. Again and again, Gilgalad's deadly archers fired their arrows into Mordor's ranks, felling them by the hundreds and thousands, whilst the latter chopped and clubbed their way through the Alliance's center line, in an effort to break its legions into two so that they could be enveloped and worn down separately by superior numbers. Gilgalad and Elendil held firm at the center, however, even against the personal advances of the Nazgul Lord himself, and slowly, Sauron's forces were pushed back towards the Towers of the Teeth, which flanked the Black Gate. For weeks, the two sides fought desperately, each drawing on every feint and device they possessed. Sauron's catapults hurled gigantic stones into the Allied lines, while flocks of great eagles rained boulders and debris on the orcs and barbarians from high above. There are stories claiming that all the living races of Middle-earth, including bird and beast, fought on both sides at the height of the battle, save for the elves, who fought only for Gilgalad. At one point, the Lord of the Nazgul engaged Gilgalad hand to hand, and almost bested him, before a well-aimed thrust of Aeglos pierced his shoulder, whereupon his shrieks of pain echoed across the entire field of battle, chilling the hearts of ally and foe alike. It was a crippling blow to the Black forces, for it forced the undead sorcerer to retire from the field, and probably saved the battle for the Alliance. From that point onward, the enemy's forces began to gradually crumble and fall back. To be sure, the tide of the battle was almost turned again against the Alliance when Sauron's outflanking army turned up at Dagorlad from the east, but Mordor's hopes were dashed when the elven archers and foot soldiers, heartened by the defeat of the Lord of the Nazgul, quickly cut them to pieces. At the last, Sauron unleashed his last and worst weapon, 3 fire drakes nurtured in the belly of Orodruin itself. With their fierce spouts of smoking flame, they threatened to devastate the Allied front lines, but fortunately they lasted only minutes before being felled by elvish arrows and spears, human swords, and dwarvish axes. That was it. With the defeat of the dragons, Mordor's forces finally broke, and those which did not scatter into the hinterlands beyond the battle plain retreated back through the Black Gate to Mordor. The battle was over, and the last alliance was victorious once again. Something like 100,000 elves, dwarves, men, and orcs lay slain on the plain of Dagorlad. In the centuries that have passed since the battle, Dagorlad has gradually been overtaken by marshy swampland, and according to the tales, even today the eerily preserved corpses of those who perished can still be seen floating in the fetid waters. Sauron was not beaten quite yet, however. Though he had been thrice defeated in the field, each time on a more crushing scale than before, he still held Mordor, and his fortress of Barad-dûr was as well garrisoned and impregnable as ever. If Gil-galad and Elendil meant to clinch a permanent victory, they would have to invade Mordor itself and fight Sauron on his own ground. This was precisely what they intended to do, however. The alliance had lost something like 40,000 soldiers at Dagorlad, to be sure, but its ranks were judged by the two High Kings to still be sufficiently strong to press their advantage into Sauron's realm. Only 3 days after scoring their great and hard-purchased victory, therefore, the captains sounded the advance, and the invasion of Mordor began. The black gates were quickly broken open and breached, and the armies poured in. 3 days later they crossed Udun and passed the Isenmouth. Another 3 days after that they stood before the walls of Barad-dûr itself, and here, at the brink of total victory, the war again slogged to a frustrating halt. Though undoubtedly daunted by the sight of 80,000 enemy troops encamped at his door, Sauron well knew the defenses of his tower fortress, and if he offered the alliance any peace terms, they are not recorded by history. Gil-galad and Elendil settled down to a siege, therefore, and dug themselves patiently in. Year after bitter year slipped by, with each side trying to wait the other out. Occasionally Sauron would order orcish assaults and assaults from his tower. These made small inroads into allied numbers. It seems likely that the Dark Lord was counting on the barren, inhospitable nature of the plain of Gogoroth to starve the alliance into giving up and retreating. If so, it was of no avail, for Isildur and Anarion saw to it that food and supplies were commandeered from Gondor's provinces, and regularly sent to the army by way of wagon convoys, so things dragged on. In Narquelier of 3440, 6 years into the siege, Anarion, son of Elendil, who had bravely, if somewhat ingloriously, fought by his father and brother's side all throughout the war, was struck on the head by a falling missile from one of Barad-dûr's ramparts, and killed. He was 209 years old at the time, and had reigned as co-ruler of Gondor for 120 years. With the death of his brother, Isildur now became sole king of Gondor, and it seems that Anarion's death gave rise to a fevered determination on his brother's part to see Mordor vanquished and Sauron overthrown. He did not have to wait long. With supplies dwindling and his garrison slowly succumbing to the ravages of starvation, in Narrier of 3441, Sauron decided to launch an all-or-nothing attempt to break the siege, and ordered a last massive thrust made up of the remainder of his fell warriors. By now well-seasoned lines of the alliance fought more viciously than ever, and arrows flew and swords slashed in a whirlwind of assaults and counter-assaults that pushed the battle lines all the way across the plateau of Gorgoroth to the slopes of Mount Doom itself. Presently Gil-galad and Elendil led a charge at the particularly dense center of the enemy line, intoxicated by the smell of the victory that they knew could not be far off. And here tragedy struck. Sauron, at last forsaking the safety of his tower, had assumed personal leadership of his troops, and at the climax of the battle came face to face with the two High Kings. The latter fought with supreme courage, ferocity, and skill, but Sauron was no mere Nazgul lord. Gil-galad and Elendil were outmatched, and each perished under the Maya's withering blows. Sauron did not get away unscathed either, however, and so great were his wounds from the duel that he fell to the ground, brought to the point of death. Isildur, who had happened to be near at hand, then took up the shard of his father's broken sword Narsil, and chopped from Sauron's hand the great ruling ring, an artifact of incredible mystical power, and Sauron's mainstay on life at that point. This proved to be the Dark Lord's death blow, and it ended not only the war, but the Second Age of the Sun itself. After 7 years of siege and 12 years of war, Gondor and her allies were utterly victorious, and the War of the Last Alliance was over. Following the withdrawal from Mordor, the 50,000 or so haggard troops that remained of the Last Alliance rapidly dispersed, with the elven and dwarvish contingents returning to their homes in the north, bearing their fallen in tow. Many of the northern men, however, chose to remain in Gondor permanently and quickly blended into the native population, being granted generous land plots by the crown. Isildur, now the titular High King of the Edain in the wake of his father's death, went about ably organizing the affairs of the kingdom before heading north to secure his rulership over Arnor. A solemn memorial was held in Minas Anor for all Gondorian knights who had fallen in the war, and Isildur planted a second sapling of the white tree there in remembrance of his faithful brother Anarion, the first having been destroyed in the capture of Minas Ithil by Sauron 12 years earlier. He then proceeded to crown the latter's one remaining son, Meneldil, as King of Gondor, and conferred on his brother's descendants the perpetual rights to the rule of the southern kingdom. This was to be of enormous importance to later events in Gondorian history. Some 30 monarchs were to follow Meneldil on the White Throne, and because all were to be descended from Anarion, they are known as the Anarioni. However, since Meneldil did not directly succeed his father, but rather his uncle Isildur, I will refer to the series of kings that followed him as the line of Meneldil, rather than as the line of Anarion. In Sulemay of the year 2 of the newly begun Third Age of the Sun, Isildur somewhat precipitously judged the situation in the south to be in order, and marched north to take up the scepter of Anuminis in Arnor with his wife and children in tow. The story goes that Meneldil, who was apparently not fond of his vainglorious, warlike uncle, privately celebrated he and his family's departure from Gondor, and dearly hoped that they never returned. If so, he got his wish, for only a few weeks into their journey, as the royal procession passed through the gladdened fields just east of the Misty Mountains, disaster descended. A party of orcs, no doubt a remnant of Mordor's defeated army, ambushed Isildur's train. Taken utterly by surprise, he and his entourage put up a valiant fight, but they were outnumbered, and nearly all were killed, including the king. All his sons were slain as well, the only survivor being his youngest child, a 13-year-old princeling named Valandil. The poor boy, now titular High King of Arnor, had been left behind in Imladris at the start of the War of the Last Alliance, under the protection of Elrond Half-Elven, and there he remained through the rest of his minority. Thus ended the adventurous life of Isildur, son of Elendil, 123 years after becoming king. Though he had shown himself at certain times in his career to be mercurial and arrogant, his courage in battle was undeniable, his devotion to his duties as king ironclad, his loyalty to his family absolute. It had been he who had instigated the forming of the last alliance, had fought heroically in every battle of the war, and had personally slain Sauron at the last. It is therefore small wonder that his deeds have become legend, not only in Gondor, but throughout all of Middle-earth. The greatest pity of his life was that he never lived to claim the high kingship over the Edain that would have been his had he not met his unlucky and ignominious end at the Gladden Field.